The bells didn't sound like wedding bells that morning. They sounded like a warning low, hollow, and a little too heavy for joy. Grace stood at the back of St. Matthew's, holding lilies that smelled more like goodbye than forever. The whole town was watching, thinking they were witnessing love. But she knew what this really was: a bargain, a debt paid in vows. He was the man who could save her family, and the man who might never love her back. Sometimes, the heart doesn't break all at once. Sometimes, it signs a contract first. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's begin. The bells of St. Mary's by the Sea rang 11 times, each strike muffled by fog and the slow heartbeat of the tide. Their echo drifted over Harbor Point, dissolving into the white air that blurred the horizon where land and water forgot each other. Grace Whitaker stood at the church's open door, her fingers whitening around a bouquet of cedar sprigs and tiny white roses already browning at the edges. Her breath came shallow. She told herself it was from the cold. Inside, the scent of old hymnals and salt damp wood pressed around her. The pews were filled with faces she had known all her life: fishermen's wives, the postmaster, even Noah Hart from the harbor office in his best jacket. No music played, just the restless hiss of the sea outside and the slow creak of benches as people leaned forward to watch her walk. They called it a wedding, though the air carried the stillness of a funeral. She took her first step down the narrow aisle, her heels clicking softly against worn pine boards polished by generations of boots. Each step felt measured, like counting debt. She kept her eyes on the altar, where Cole Harrington stood in a dark suit that fit him like certainty. He was tall, perfectly straight, every button aligned, the kind of man who had never been late, never unsure, never without control. Even from a distance she could see the sharp set of his jaw, the restraint in his hands folded before him. He did not smile. He did not look at her. Grace's mother sat in the front pew, her silver hair pinned carefully, hands clenched around a lace handkerchief. Beside her, Ben stared at the floor, his face calm in that unmoored way that came since the stroke. Every few seconds his lips moved, whispering fragments of songs no one else could hear. The sight of him tightened something behind Grace's ribs. She forced her spine straight. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of them. At the altar, she paused. The minister's voice trembled faintly as he welcomed them, words about love and unity floating thin and hollow in the damp air. When he invited them to speak privately before the vows, Cole inclined his head slightly and stepped closer. His voice, low enough that only she could hear, carried the smoothness of a practiced surgeon delivering prognosis. "After this," he murmured, "I'll have the bank release the lien on the inn. The first payment for your father's therapy goes through Monday. The medication shipment will follow the next week." He waited a beat, the way men do when expecting acknowledgement of a transaction. Grace kept her gaze on the small cross behind him, its brass edges catching a shard of weak morning light. "I remember," she said quietly. "I'm here for my parents. That's all that matters." Cole's gray eyes flickered some quick, unreadable thing passing before he straightened. "Then let's begin." The ceremony unfolded like a rehearsal. Words repeated, hands lifted, promises spoken with precision. She felt none of it. Her voice came when prompted, calm, clear, almost detached from her body. It floated upward into the rafters like someone else's confession. Cole's tone was the same as when she'd heard him in the hospital corridor, steady, professional, stripped of warmth. When the minister asked if there was love between them, neither answered. The question hung a moment too long before the old man moved on, perhaps thinking he had asked it only in his mind. Outside, a gull screamed once, sharp as a tear in fabric. The ring slipped over her finger, cool and heavy. For an instant, she imagined throwing it into the pews, watching it roll under someone's boot, hearing the scatter of surprise. But her hand didn't move. Instead, she felt the tremor of her own heartbeat against the band's smooth edge. When it came time for the kiss, Cole leaned toward her. He did not search her eyes. He only brushed his lips against her temple, a gesture without heat, more command than affection. The cedar scent of her bouquet mixed with his faint cologne, clean, surgical. The brief touch was done before anyone could call it intimacy. From the front pew, Evelyn made a small, broken sound that was half sob, half prayer. Grace wanted to reach out to her mother, to whisper that it was fine, that this bargain was better than losing everything. But her throat felt lined with sand. Applause rose uncertainly, polite and thin. The organist began a tune out of habit, the notes wobbling before giving up. Cole offered his arm. She took it. His sleeve felt stiff under her fingers, as though the fabric itself refused warmth. They walked together down the aisle into the gray light. Outside, mist beaded on Grace's lashes, cold enough to sting. The townspeople lingered on the steps, whispering the way small towns do, some out of sympathy, others out of fascination. She caught Noah's eyes among them, the look of someone trying not to show pity. He gave a slow nod, as if saying, "You did what you had to." She returned it with the faintest tilt of her head. The car waiting at the curb was black, polished, silent. Cole opened the rear door without ceremony. "We'll drive to the inn first," he said. "Your parents should see the deed signed before the notary leaves." His tone made it sound like a checklist item. Grace slid inside. The leather seat was cold, smelling faintly of brine and new upholstery. As the car pulled away, she turned once to watch the church recede into fog. Its steeple disappeared first, then the bell, then the last line of people on the steps. Only the sound of the waves remained. Cole sat beside her, hands clasped on his knee, gaze fixed forward. The road wound along the coast, and through the window she glimpsed flashes of white surf breaking against black rock. Somewhere deep within the noise of the engine, she thought she heard the faint chime of the church bell again. 1, 2, then silence. She pressed the bouquet against her lap, petals trembling with each turn. When she looked down, she noticed a postcard tucked among them, a picture of the old lighthouse her father once kept before the stroke. Someone her mother, maybe had written in looping script across the back, "Keep the light burning." Grace folded the card carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The sea stretched beside them, endless and indifferent. Cole finally spoke, his voice barely louder than the tires on wet asphalt. "You'll have full access to the household accounts for your parents' needs. We can keep separate quarters. It's simpler." She nodded once. "That's fine." He hesitated, perhaps expecting a question, perhaps hoping for none. When she didn't look at him, he turned his eyes back to the gray road ahead. The car climbed a final hill. At its crest, the Atlantic opened wide, slate and silver. The wind bent the pines toward land. For a moment, Grace thought of all the people who had stood in that church before her real weddings, laughter spilling down those steps. Then she thought of her father's hand, trembling as he tried to hold a coffee cup, and her mother's quiet prayers whispered through sleepless nights. She drew a slow breath, letting the salt fill her lungs, and whispered so softly that he couldn't hear, "It's just a paper. It doesn't own me." But the bell in her mind tolled once more, low, certain, final. It sounded very much like a door closing somewhere behind her. 6 weeks earlier, the wind off the Atlantic carried the smell of iron and rain. Grace Whitaker pulled her coat tighter and shifted her father's arm higher over her shoulder. They moved down the narrow sidewalk toward the physical therapy building, half a mile from the Harbor Lantern Inn, counting steps together the way the therapist had taught them, 20 forward, pause, breathe, 20 more. Ben's hand trembled against her sleeve, his gait uneven. "Left, right, left," she whispered. When he stumbled, she caught him by the elbow. The chill cut through both their coats, but he grinned at her faintly, proud he hadn't fallen. She smiled back, though her breath came fast from the effort. By the time they reached the glass doors of the rehab clinic, her phone was buzzing again in her pocket. The number on the screen belonged to the bank. She silenced it and helped her father inside. While he worked with the therapist, Grace sat by the window watching gulls dive between gray waves. Her phone blinked twice more before she finally answered. Mrs. Whitaker. This is Harold from Coastal Savings, a voice said, too polite to be kind. I'm calling about your loan. She pressed her fingertips to her temple. I made a payment last month. Yes, ma'am, but the balloon clause on your mortgage matures next quarter. We'll need $30,000 to renew, plus 6 months arrears on utilities. $30,000? The number landed like a stone in her chest. I'll find a way, she said, keeping her tone calm. We'll need confirmation before the 15th. After the call ended, she stared at the cracked phone screen until the battery icon flashed red. She'd left her charger back at the inn, where the hallway light flickered and one of the upstairs radiators refused to heat. That night, she returned home after dark. The inn smelled of lemon oil and wood smoke, clean but weary. Evelyn was in the kitchen folding napkins for guests who no longer came. Only 2 rooms had been rented that month. Grace kissed her mother's temple and set a grocery bag on the counter. Bread, milk, a few apples, and the cheapest cut of beef she could find. How was therapy? Evelyn asked. Dad walked 20 steps without stopping. Her mother's eyes softened. You're doing too much, Gracie. Grace smiled faintly. It's not too much if it keeps us here. Later, when the house was quiet, she sat at the small desk in her childhood room with a pad of paper and a calculator. Numbers crossed out, rewritten, squeezed into margins, income from guests, tips from the diner, her second job at the school cafeteria. The total barely covered medicine and fuel. She had $42 left in her checking account. The next morning, she visited North Shore Regional with a folder of her father's medical paperwork. The receptionist clicked through files, shaking her head. The trial medication isn't approved under your plan. You need to cover it out of pocket. How much? The woman checked the screen. Roughly $4,000 a month, plus lab work. Grace exhaled slowly. Thank you. Outside, the parking lot shimmered with salt and sleet. She stood for a long time beside the car, watching her breath ghost the windshield. It would have been easy to let the frustration boil up, to curse the hospital, the bank, fate, but she had learned early that anger wasted time. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and started the car. 2 days later, she took a catering shift at the hospital fundraiser, trading her uniform at the inn for a black blouse and stiff shoes. The ballroom glittered with string lights and crystal. Wealthy donors moved like bright fish in an aquarium, laughter polished, champagne glass in hand. Grace kept her head down, balancing a tray of canapes, smiling when someone said, "Thank you." Near the dessert table stood Marla Keene, tall, elegant, wrapped in a silk shawl the color of wet slate. Grace recognized her from the hospital newsletters, chairwoman of the North Shore Board. Known for her generosity and her precision, Marla was speaking to a man from the local paper when she noticed Grace passing. "You there," Marla said lightly. "Could we get more coffee for the north table?" "Of course." Grace set the tray down and poured from the silver urn, careful not to spill. Marla's eyes flicked to her hands, noting the faint marks across Grace's ring finger where she'd once worn a band. "You're from Harbor Point, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am. Small inn by the pier," Grace nodded. "The harbor lantern." Marla smiled in that distant, assessing way people with money often do. "Charming place. I used to stay there years ago before the renovations downtown." "It's still there," Grace said quietly. "Just smaller than it used to be." Marla studied her for a moment longer, eyes sharp. "You have the look of someone who knows what she's worth but can't quite afford it. That's a compliment. Dear?" Grace didn't answer. She finished pouring, thanked her, and walked away, feeling the weight of that observation settle like dust. The night ran long. When it ended, Grace counted her tips, $28. The drive home took 30 minutes through fog. She parked behind the inn and climbed the narrow porch steps. The wind carried the smell of rain again, metallic and cold. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Evelyn's sewing machine hummed faintly inside. She was mending curtains even at midnight. Grace smiled at the sound her mother's rhythm, steady against uncertainty. She rounded the corner toward the side entrance, the one guests never used. Something bright red caught her eye. A sheet of paper was taped to the door, fluttering in the wind. She stepped closer, heart thudding. The words were block letters stamped across the top. Final notice. The paper listed the account number, the amount owed, and a date circled in black ink, 10 days. For a moment, she just stood there, the air sharp in her lungs. Then she reached for it, but her mother's voice came from the doorway behind her. "Grace." "What's that?" Evelyn's hand trembled as she tried to peel the notice from the door, her fingers brushing Grace's. "They can't do this. Can they?" "Not now." Grace folded the paper quickly, forcing a calm smile she didn't feel. "It's just a formality. I'll fix it." Her mother looked at her with watery eyes, believing because she needed to. When Evelyn turned back inside, Grace stayed on the porch a moment longer. The wind tugged at her hair, somewhere down the street. A buoy bell chimed once, mournful and hollow. She unfolded the notice again, staring at the numbers under the porch light. 10 days, $30,000. She slipped the paper into her coat pocket and pressed her hand over it as if to hide it from the night. Inside, she heard her father humming a broken tune from his chair, the melody floating through the thin walls like memory. Grace closed her eyes and whispered to the wind, "I'll fix it," though the words felt fragile, paper thin, already torn by the sea air. The hospital was nearly empty at that hour, its corridors echoing with the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hiss of ventilators far down the hall. The cafeteria had closed, the volunteer desk dark. Only a single vending machine glowed near the elevators, humming softly beside the atrium doors. Grace waited there, coat folded over her arm, the smell of disinfectant faint on the air. It was 9:10 p.m. when Dr. Cole Harrington appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking as if each step was a decision already made. His posture was precise, hands in his coat pockets, the white of his shirt catching the sterile light. He nodded once in greeting, not warmth acknowledgement. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his tone even. "Thank you for coming." Grace straightened, wary. "You said it was urgent. It is." He motioned toward the atrium, where a wall of glass revealed the dark outline of the parking lot and the faint blinking light of a distant tower. The chairs were empty. Somewhere above, the HVAC unit rumbled like far-off thunder. Cole stopped at a small table near the window, pulled a folder from his briefcase, and placed it neatly before her. "I'll be direct," he began. "I can settle your family's debt to Coastal Savings within 48 hours. I can also underwrite your father's medication, full coverage, trial or not, and fund his speech therapy indefinitely." Grace blinked, thrown by the bluntness. "Why?" He met her eyes without blinking. "Because I need something too." There was no preamble, no attempt to soften the blow. "A public marriage," he continued. "Within 30 days, a real ceremony. Documents filed, photographs released. You'd remain my wife legally for at least a year. After that, if either party wishes to dissolve the union, it will be handled quietly." Grace stared at him. "You're serious? Entirely?" She laughed once, quietly, though it wasn't amusement. "You want to buy a wife." Cole's expression didn't shift. "I want stability optics. The hospital board vote on the Coastal Clinic expansion happens next quarter. Certain members, mostly investors, question my suitability to lead the foundation. They prefer visible stability." "Meaning a wife," she said flatly. He nodded. "Meaning the appearance of one?" Grace leaned back, crossing her arms. "You could hire an actress. It would be simpler." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "An actress would expect to perform. I need someone who can exist quietly, convincingly, without creating spectacle." She studied him across the table. The man was carved from self-control hair precise, cufflinks catching the faint light. Eyes the color of a winter sky just before snow. The kind of man used to getting exactly what he negotiated for. "What's in it for me?" she asked, though she already knew. "The in-debt, your father's treatment, and an allowance for your family's living expenses." He slid the folder toward her. Inside were typed pages, dense with clauses. "It's all here." Grace flipped through the first few pages. Mortgage release, medical coverage, monthly stipend, even a line item for home repairs at the Harbor Lantern. Every need answered in black and white. "This is absurd," she said, voice low, maybe, but effective. Her eyes skimmed further down. Paragraph 8. Non-disclosure. Public appearances as determined by mutual agreement. Paragraph 9. No romantic obligation or physical expectation unless expressly consented. She looked up sharply. "You've done this before." "No." His tone cooled a degree. "But I've written contracts long enough to know what destroys them." Something inside her twisted, part fear, part curiosity. "And what exactly would you be to me? A benefactor. A husband in legal terms only. You'd have your independence, separate quarters, and control over your own finances." He paused. "No one would question your dignity." The word hung between them. Dignity. As if he understood that was the only currency she had left. Grace took a slow breath, feeling the exhaustion of months condense behind her ribs. The smell of antiseptic clung to her clothes. Beyond the glass wall, a nurse pushed a mop down the hallway, her reflection ghosting past them in the dark window. "This board vote," Grace said quietly. "Is it about the free clinic?" He nodded once. "Harbor Point can't sustain another year without medical outreach. The grant covers half, the board the rest. If they think I'm unstable, they'll cut it. So, you're doing this for your patients. I'm doing this for results," he replied. The silence stretched. Grace thought of her father's unsteady steps, her mother's trembling hands, the red notice folded in her coat pocket. The number 30,000 glared in her mind. She closed the folder, pressing her palm against its cool surface. "I want every term in writing. No hidden clauses, no surprises. Of course. And my parents' names added to the protection clause. Done." He reached into his briefcase again, produced another envelope already notarized. Prenuptial agreement. "You'll keep any assets or income you earn during the arrangement. I'll have my attorney deliver revised copies by morning." Grace felt the room tilt slightly. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a transaction written in air. She should have walked out. She should have said no. But the image of her father's vacant stare during therapy, his halting attempts at words, anchored her to the chair. "You don't even know me," she said finally. "I know enough," Cole replied. "You pay your bills on time when you can. You refuse charity. And you haven't missed a day at the diner in 2 years. That tells me more than introductions ever could." Her pulse stumbled. "You had me checked. Of course. I don't gamble with unknowns." For a moment, she hated him. For his precision. For knowing exactly how little room she had left to bargain. She took the pen lying beside the folder, the hospital logo gleaming on its side, and signed her name where he indicated. The nib scratched faintly against the paper. Cole reached to take the document, but she kept her hand there a second longer. "Add one more clause," she said. He paused. "Which is no humiliation, not in public, not in private, not ever." For the first time. His eyes softened just slightly, as if he recognized something familiar in the demand. He nodded once, deliberate. Then, "Don't humiliate me either." Their gazes held, two people measuring the cost of what they'd just agreed to. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the glass, and somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped steadily, like a distant heartbeat. Grace folded her copy of the contract and slipped it into her bag. "When do we start pretending tomorrow?" Cole said. "We'll make it look real." He stood, buttoned his coat, and left her there in the blue-white light, the echo of his footsteps fading into the sterile hum. Grace remained seated, staring at her reflection in the glass wall, the outline of a woman who looked calm, composed, unbreakable. But, under her breath, she whispered to the empty atrium, "I hope I still recognize myself when this is over." The house on Ocean Bluff wasn't built for warmth. It stood like a prism of glass and cedar against the restless Atlantic, perched high enough that the windows caught both sunrise and storm. When Grace first arrived, her suitcase looked absurdly small beside the sleek black sedan that had brought her. The wind off the cliffs pressed at her coat, salt and chill mixing with the faint hum of the waves below. Cole was already waiting by the door, keycard in hand. "You'll find the guest wing stocked," he said simply. Left corridor, second door. He didn't call it home. He didn't call her wife, just a place the guest wing. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine and something sterile. The floors gleamed. The walls were bare except for one massive photograph of the sea, taken in winter, gray and endless. Grace's reflection floated on its surface, small and uncertain. Her room faced the inlet, a quiet curve of water that shimmered under moonlight like mercury. She unpacked in silence jeans, 2 sweaters, the old cardigan her mother had knitted, on the nightstand. She placed the postcard from the lighthouse, the one tucked in her wedding bouquet. "Keep the light burning." From somewhere deeper in the house came the muffled sound of a drawer closing, then footsteps fading. Cole's wing lay beyond the central hall, larger, quieter, a place she instinctively didn't enter. That first week, they moved like strangers rehearsing an unspoken choreography. He left early each morning, the engine of his car dissolving into the wind. She heard the faint echo of his shoes in the foyer around 6, the rustle of papers, the soft click of the front door. By the time the kettle whistled in the kitchen, he was gone. At night, he'd return after 10. Dinner was separate, unannounced. Grace ate at the small table by the window, the news murmuring softly from the radio. He preferred the kitchen island, standing, reading something on his tablet while the microwave hummed. Sometimes their eyes met through the reflection in the glass cabinet. A polite nod, a quiet evening, then the clink of dishes, the faint sigh of the ocean outside, and silence settling between them again. Grace filled her days with errands, taking soup to her parents, visiting the inn to help her mother with paperwork, walking the shoreline until her thoughts softened enough to breathe. She told Evelyn she was working for the Harrington Foundation, which wasn't entirely a lie. But nights in that house were another thing. The quiet there was too precise, like it had been designed to keep secrets. One evening, rain streaked the windows in long silver lines. She found herself standing in the kitchen, tracing a fingertip around the rim of a coffee mug. Cole appeared without a sound, setting down his briefcase. His hair was damp, a strand fallen over his forehead. "There's chowder in the fridge," she said, unsure why she felt the need to speak. He nodded. "I'm not hungry. You should eat." He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering behind his gray eyes. "You always sound like you mean that," he said quietly, then turned away before she could answer. When he left the room, she noticed it again, the door halfway down his hallway. It was unremarkable at first glance, painted white like the rest, but he always kept it closed. She'd never seen him open it, though sometimes, when she walked past to the laundry room, she caught a faint line of light under the frame. At first, she thought it might be a utility closet or his study. But one night, near 2 in the morning, she woke to a sound. Not wind, not the creak of the old house settling. Music, a piano, soft, deliberate, half-formed melodies that floated through the air like someone remembering how to feel. She sat up, heartbeat quick. The sound was faint but real, winding through the hallways. Barefoot. She padded out of her room, the wooden floor cool under her feet. The house was dim, only the moon through the skylight guiding her steps. The melody came from that locked door, a slow waltz, broken and unfinished, pausing between phrases as if the player was searching for the next note. Grace stopped outside it, pressing her hand lightly to the handle. The brass was cold. She tried it gently. It didn't move, locked, just as she expected. But she stayed there anyway, listening. For a moment, she imagined the person inside some ghost of who Cole might have been before the glass house and the suits. The notes quivered, then stopped. Silence. Then his voice behind her, low, close. "That room," he said, "is not for you." Grace turned sharply. He stood a few feet away, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, eyes shadowed by the low light. There was no anger in his tone, just something final, an edge of exhaustion. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly. "I heard music." His gaze flicked to the door, then back to her. "You didn't?" The words landed oddly past tense, like a correction of reality itself. He stepped forward, reached past her, and pressed his thumb against the biometric lock. The light above the handle flickered red, then green, then dark again. Grace swallowed. "Is it your study?" He didn't answer. "You should be asleep." "I couldn't." He looked at her a long moment, as if deciding whether to explain. Then he said softly, "Some rooms aren't meant for the living." Before she could speak, he turned and walked back toward his wing, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the carpeted hall. Grace stared at the door one last time. The silence behind it felt heavier now. Not empty, but full of something she couldn't name. The kind of silence that remembers. When she returned to her room, the sea had gone still outside, the moonlight trembling on the water like breath. She climbed into bed and lay awake, the echo of that half-played melody looping through her mind. She didn't know what frightened her more, that he'd been playing alone at 2 a.m, or that he'd stopped the moment she listened. The house creaked once, settling, Grace whispered to herself. Then, who was the music? For the wind answered by pressing against the glass, steady, patient, the sound of the ocean trying to get in. The morning was sharp and wind-bitten. The sky washed clean after a night of rain. Grace led her father down the jetty, their steps slow and deliberate against the slick stones. The tide was still high, curling around the rocks in silver foam. Each time a wave broke, the spray hit her face, cold enough to sting. 20. Pause. She murmured. Now again. Dad. Left. Right. Left. Ben Whitaker smiled faintly, his lips forming half words, breath clouding the air. He concentrated hard, the sound rough but steady. Left. Right. She kept one hand on his elbow, the other ready in case he lost balance. For a moment, when he managed the count without her prompting, Grace let herself breathe. His progress was slow, but it was something real, one step further from the helplessness that had swallowed their home months ago. When they reached the end of the jetty, Ben stopped and looked out toward the harbor. Still. Pretty, he said, the words shaped carefully. Grace's throat tightened. Yeah, she whispered. Still. She helped him back toward the bench where Evelyn waited with a thermos of tea. Her mother's smile was thin but proud. He's stronger every week, Evelyn said. Maybe next time he'll make it all the way to the beacon. That old thing, Evelyn laughed softly. It's been there longer than any of us. Probably watched over every mistake we ever made. Grace smiled and kissed her mother's cheek before turning toward the parking lot. She saw Cole's car before she saw him, the sleek black sedan too clean for Harbor Point's gravel roads. He stood beside it, coat collar turned up, hair caught by the wind. The moment their eyes met, she knew something was wrong. You didn't answer my message, he said. I was busy walking my father. I noticed. His tone carried the practiced calm of someone used to being obeyed. We have a photo shoot scheduled at the lighthouse at 4. Press and board members. It's for the clinic expansion announcement. She stopped a few feet away. You scheduled us without asking me? It's a standard publicity requirement. Our marriage is part of my professional image. Grace, you knew that. I knew you wanted quiet appearances, not staged ones. Cole exhaled slowly. Every hospital that runs on donations depends on optics. The board expects a unified front. You don't have to do much stand beside me, smile, shake hands. I'm not a prop for your reputation, she said sharply. You should have asked. Something flickered behind his eyes, annoyance. Maybe surprised that she'd raise her voice. You agreed to help me, remember? That was the condition. I agreed to marry you to save my parents, not to pose for your cameras. He took a step closer, voice dropping. Be careful how you frame that. If people start asking why we married so quickly, the entire project could fall apart. Do you want that on your conscience? Grace's jaw clenched. You think I'm sabotaging your vote because I don't want to play dress up in front of your friends. You've avoided every public event since the ceremony, he countered. The board has started asking questions. Then tell them the truth, she said. Tell them you forced a stranger into your life because you didn't want to look unstable. The air between them went still. His mouth tightened, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw something fragile in his expression. Not anger, exactly, but something close to guilt. Then his voice came quiet, controlled. You didn't marry a saint. Grace. No, she said, meeting his gaze. I didn't marry a puppet either. The wind picked up, tugging strands of hair across her face. A gull screamed overhead, circling the harbor before diving toward the water. Cole turned away first. Be ready at 4, he said, already walking toward the car. I'm not going, she called after him. He stopped, half-turned. Don't make this harder than it already is. Then stop treating me like a photo caption. He said nothing more. The car door shut with a quiet thud, and a few seconds later, the engine faded into the distance, leaving only the hiss of the waves against rock. Grace stood there for a long time, letting the cold settle into her bones. The argument replayed in her head, sharper each time his words, her own. Somewhere deep down, under the anger, was a thin thread of shame. She had wanted him to understand. But maybe understanding was something he'd long forgotten how to give. She started back down the jetty, the tide pulling lower now, exposing seaweed and slick stones. The wind had shifted. It came in gusts, pushing against her coat. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her steps, the same 20 count she used with her father. When she reached the midpoint, her foot slipped on a patch of wet kelp. The world tilted the gray sky, the glint of water, the taste of salt in her mouth, and then a hand caught her. Strong fingers gripped her waist, steady and unyielding. For a heartbeat, she didn't understand what had happened. Then she turned and saw him, Cole, standing just behind her, his coat whipping in the wind. He must have turned the car around. His hand still held her firmly, the pulse of it visible against her ribs. Careful, he said, his voice rougher than usual. She tried to breathe, the closeness startling her. You came back? He didn't answer. His hand lingered 1 second too long before he pulled it away. The warmth of his touch vanished instantly, replaced by the chill of the ocean air. I forgot something, he said, though his tone didn't sound like truth. Grace swallowed. You always this good at rescuing people who don't want saving. His mouth curved slightly, but not into a smile, only when they insist on walking near the edge. She stepped back, brushing sea spray from her sleeve. You should get to your photo shoot. He looked at her, then really looked as if seeing something he hadn't before. It's been rescheduled, he said quietly. You were right. It could wait. The wind carried their silence out over the water, scattering it into the gulls' cries. Grace turned toward the shore, her steps careful this time. Behind her, Cole lingered, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea in a single pale line. When she finally reached the end of the jetty, she looked back once. He was still there, hands in his pockets, the figure of a man made of distance and restraint. The waves broke against the rocks below, sending mist into the air like breath. She whispered to no one. Maybe we both needed saving. The winter wind settled over Harbor Point with the weight of damp wool. Inside the old inn, the lights were soft and yellow, and the air smelled faintly of lemon oil and coffee grounds. Grace sat cross-legged on the parlor rug beside her mother, both of them bent over a half-finished quilt. The squares came from worn-in linens, some patterned with faint blue stripes, others plain white, edges fraying. Evelyn hummed softly while stitching, her hands careful despite the stiffness in her fingers. This one, she said, lifting a square with a coffee stain shaped like a small heart, came from the summer the college kids stayed. Remember how they left their mugs everywhere? Grace smiled. I remember how you wouldn't throw anything away. Waste not, Evelyn murmured. Besides, Everything deserves another use. They worked until the clock on the mantel struck 10. Outside, snow began to fall in slow spirals. The inn's windows glowed like small lanterns against the dark. When Grace finally stood, stretching her back, Evelyn handed her a folded section of the quilt. "For your house?" she said softly. Grace hesitated. "It doesn't feel like my house." Her mother looked at her, eyes gentle but knowing. "Then make it one." Grace didn't answer. She tucked the quilt under her arm, kissed her mother's cheek, and stepped out into the cold. The drive back to Ocean Bluff was quiet. The sky was ink dark, the ocean hidden beneath it, but she could hear the surf rolling somewhere below the cliffs. When she pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a single light in the foyer. Cole's car was gone. Inside, the air felt too still. She hung her coat on the rack and carried the quilt upstairs to her room. The smell of cedar lingered from the fireplace downstairs, faint but comforting. She had made extra soup that evening, chicken and barley, simple and warm. She ladled it into a glass container and placed it on the middle shelf of the refrigerator. She didn't leave a note. She just closed the door quietly, knowing he would see it when he came home. The clock ticked past midnight. Grace tried to sleep but couldn't. The wind pressed against the glass panes. The house creaked like it was thinking. She lay awake listening for the sound of the garage door. But it didn't come. At 1:15, headlights swept briefly across the bedroom wall. A car door shut. Then the faint hum of footsteps entered the house. Grace got up, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders, and padded barefoot down the hall. The kitchen light was on. Cole stood by the sink, still in his scrubs, his coat draped over a chair. His hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. Water dripped from his wrists into the sink, the rhythm uneven. For a moment she thought he was washing something, but then she saw he wasn't. He was just standing there, shaking. She didn't speak. Instead, she filled the kettle, the sound of water soft against the silence. When it began to hiss, she took a mug from the shelf and dropped in a teabag chamomile. The smell bloomed, light and grassy. Cole didn't move until she slid the mug next to him. He glanced at it, then at her, eyes red-rimmed, pupils dulled by exhaustion. "You should be asleep," he said, voice low, flat. "So should you." He let out a small, humorless breath and looked back down at his hands. She was 6. Grace waited, ruptured valve. He continued. "We knew it was risky. I've done that procedure before dozens of times. But tonight," his voice caught, her heart just stopped. "It shouldn't have happened. I did everything right." Grace felt something in her chest shift, the ache of empathy she hadn't expected to feel for him. Sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. He stared at the tea, as if the steam might hold an answer. His shoulders were trembling. Without thinking, Grace reached out and placed her hand lightly over his. The contact was brief, gentle. He didn't pull away. They stood like that for a long moment, saying nothing. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. Outside, waves struck the rocks below, rhythmic and relentless. When he finally lifted the mug, his hand steadied just enough to keep from spilling. He took a sip, eyes closed. "I don't usually lose," he murmured. "It's not about losing." He looked at her, then really looked, not the way he did in the daylight when his gaze was a tool of precision, but the way a man looks when the mask cracks. There was something raw there, grief, guilt, and a deep fatigue that made him seem suddenly human. "Do you ever stop carrying it?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "You just learn to set it down for a while." He nodded, eyes lowering. The steam curled upward between them, ghosting into the air. Grace leaned against the counter across from him, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. The room felt warmer now. Though neither of them had touched the thermostat, Cole drank slowly, the tremor in his hand fading with each sip. When he finished, he set the mug down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the sink as if control could still be salvaged in small ways. "Thank you," he said, almost too quietly to hear. Grace smiled faintly. "It's just tea." He shook his head. No, it's not. The clock struck 2. She gathered the empty mug and rinsed it, letting the water run over her fingers. Cole didn't move until she turned to leave. "Grace," he said. She paused in the doorway. He hesitated, words slow, like he was unused to choosing them. "You don't have to wait up for me." "I wasn't waiting," she said. He gave a small nod. Of course. But they both knew it wasn't true. She walked back down the hall, her bare feet silent on the floor. Behind her, she heard the faint scrape of a chair and the soft exhale of breath like a man letting go. Just a little. In her room, Grace folded the quilt across the foot of the bed. It smelled like home lemon oil, coffee, and something warm she couldn't name. As she lay down, she thought of him standing there in the kitchen, the broken look in his eyes, the way his hands had finally stopped shaking. She wondered if kindness always cost this much silence. Down the hall, a door clicked shut. The house returned to stillness. Outside, the sea breathed against the cliffs, steady and patient, as if it understood how fragile the living could be. The nor'easter came without warning. By afternoon, the sky over Harbor Point had turned the color of pewter, and by evening, the wind was howling through the eaves like an old animal, desperate to be let in. The house on Ocean Bluff trembled with every gust. Waves struck the cliffs hard enough to make the windows shudder in their frames. Grace had stacked candles on the kitchen counter, each flicker throwing soft gold across the glass. The power lines outside swayed dangerously. She'd already called her parents to make sure they had the generator running at the inn. Evelyn's voice had sounded thin through the static. "We'll be fine, sweetheart. Just keep warm." At 8:30, the lights blinked once, twice, then died. Silence swallowed the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the heater. Grace stood still, waiting. But the power didn't come back. She found a flashlight in the drawer and began to check each room. Cole had been at the hospital when the storm rolled in another emergency shift, he'd said. She told herself not to worry, though the image of him driving those dark coastal roads crept into her thoughts. Outside, rain lashed the windows in sheets. Lightning flickered far out to sea, briefly illuminating the waves as they rose and broke, white against black. She was about to return to her room when her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text from Ruth Delgado, the nurse practitioner at the free clinic. "He isn't cruel, Grace. He's afraid of losing control." Grace frowned, staring at the words. She typed a reply. "What do you mean?" But the message failed to send. The signal was gone. The wind rose again, louder now. And somewhere in the house, something beeped a low electronic whine. She followed the sound down the hall toward Cole's wing. It was coming from the locked door. The keypad beside the handle blinked red, then green, then red again before going dark. A surge must have fried the circuit. The lock buzzed once and released with a faint click. For a moment, Grace simply stood there, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. She knew she shouldn't, but curiosity and something deeper, something that felt like need, pushed her forward. She pressed the handle. The door drifted open. Inside was not what she expected. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust and salt. Along the far wall stretched a collage of photographs, hundreds of them, maybe more. They covered the surface edge to edge snapshots of patients in hospital gowns, children smiling from beds, nurses holding cakes, holiday cards, little thank you notes scrawled in colored markers. The light from her flashlight caught a drawing tape near the center, a stick figure with spiky hair and a big grin, holding a red balloon. Beneath it, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Dr. H." Grace moved closer, her chest tightening. The photos were carefully arranged, each with a handwritten caption, "Liam's first day home, Marcy's new heart, 2019, team night shift, North Shore." There was joy here, unmistakable, radiant. Yet beneath it all she felt an undercurrent of grief, like the echo of laughter long since faded. She turned slowly, the flashlight sweeping across a desk by the window. Papers lay neatly stacked, a stethoscope folded beside them, a small jar of sand from some beach. Then she saw it, a single framed photograph. It was larger than the rest, centered perfectly, as if it anchored the whole room. The glass was clean, the wood polished. In it, Cole stood on a wooden pier under a summer sun, smiling in a way she had never seen. Beside him was a woman with red hair that the wind had caught mid-lift, and a small boy perched on her shoulders, laughing at something out of frame. The three of them looked alive, unguarded, real. Grace reached out, tracing the edge of the frame with her fingers. The name Lila was etched in tiny letters along the bottom corner. She turned the photo over. On the back, in flowing handwriting, was a short inscription, "To the brother who saved me twice. Lila." Grace's breath caught. The words rearranged themselves in her mind until they made sense. Save me twice. Once as her surgeon, she realized, and again, perhaps as her brother, her protector. But if this picture was here alone, preserved, then Lila wasn't alive anymore. Grace felt the air thicken, heavy with salt and memory. She sank onto the edge of the desk, the flashlight beam wobbling. The storm raged outside, wind howling against the glass. But the room felt still suspended, as if the world had stopped the day that picture was taken. She could almost see it now, the accident she'd overheard whispers about, the one Cole never mentioned. A boat off the coast, a sudden squall, the kind of freak wave that flips joy into tragedy in a heartbeat. He'd performed the transplant that saved her life once, only to lose her to the sea years later. Maybe that was why the piano had gone silent, why the door had stayed locked, why he built a house of glass but lived as if behind walls of steel. Grace set the photo back carefully and looked around again. The patient letters, the drawings, the thank yous. He had filled this room with the evidence of lives he'd saved, but at the center was the one he couldn't. When the wind surged, it rattled the window so hard she startled. The flashlight flickered, then died. Darkness folded over her, thick and complete. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust to the faint glow of lightning flashing across the sea. A car engine cut through the storm outside the deep, steady sound of Cole's sedan pulling into the drive. The front door opened, slammed against the wind, then closed. She heard his footsteps fast, deliberate down the hall. The door behind her creaked. Cole stopped in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his hair dripping onto the floor. His eyes went straight to the photograph, still gleaming faintly in the lightning's afterglow. For a heartbeat, they said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, "Did you come in here when it opened?" Grace nodded. The lock failed. "I thought someone was inside." He took one slow step forward, his gaze never leaving the photo. "You shouldn't have." "I know." The wind roared again, but neither of them flinched. "I wasn't trying to pry," she said softly. "I just wanted to understand." Cole's voice came low, rougher than she'd ever heard it. "There's nothing to understand. It happened a long time ago." Grace hesitated. "She was your sister." His eyes closed. For a moment, the tension in his shoulders collapsed, and she saw the weight he carried, years of it, pressed into silence. "Yes," he said finally. "And I saved her heart once. The second time, I couldn't." The power flickered back on, flooding the room with sudden light. The photos glowed like windows into other lives, and for the first time, Grace saw tears standing in his eyes. She wanted to reach for him, but didn't. Some griefs, she knew, had to be approached like wild animals, quietly, carefully, with reverence. He turned away from her, hand gripping the edge of the desk, and whispered something she almost didn't catch. "It should have been me." Grace stepped backward toward the door. "It wasn't your fault," she said. He didn't look up. That's what people say when they can't imagine the weight. Lightning flashed again, white and blinding, then vanished into darkness. Grace left the room without another word, closing the door gently behind her. Down the hall, she paused, hand pressed against her chest. The storm rattled the windows once more, and somewhere deep inside the house, she thought she heard the faintest ghost of piano notes, a melody half-remembered, carried by the wind. The nor'easter hit Harbor Point hard and fast, the kind that made the old fishermen mutter prayers before latching their doors. By dusk, wind howled through the alleys like a living thing, hurling sleet against windows hard enough to rattle the glass. The power flickered twice at the Harbor Lantern Inn, then went out completely. Grace lit every candle she could find. The golden flames trembled in the drafts that slipped through the old frame of the house. Rain hammered the roof, and beyond the walls came the roar of the Atlantic wild, relentless, like an animal pounding to be let in. Her father sat near the hearth, wrapped in blankets. His eyes were unfocused, his mind foggy from exhaustion. Evelyn was on the phone with the electric company, but the line crackled with static and died. "Stay with him," Grace told her mother, slipping into her coat. "I'll check the generator." She barely made it past the porch before the wind hit her full in the chest. The cold sliced through fabric and skin, soaking her hair in seconds. She stumbled toward the back shed where the generator sat, half buried under snow and pine needles. The flashlight beam wobbled with each gust. When she reached the panel, she saw at once the problem, a downed power line sagging dangerously close to the ground, sparking where it met the wet gravel. She stepped back, heart hammering. The inn was cut off. She turned to run back inside when she realized the front door was open. Swinging in the wind, her stomach dropped. "Dad!" she shouted, pushing through the doorway. Evelyn's face was pale, eyes wide. "He was right here," she cried. "I went to light another candle. He was right here." Grace's pulse roared in her ears. When just now he had his coat. Grace. He's out there. Grace didn't think. She grabbed a heavier flashlight and plunged into the gale. The rain came sideways, icy needles against her cheeks. "Dad." She called, "Dad. Where are you?" Her voice was swallowed by the storm. The beam of her flashlight cut a narrow path through the chaos, catching flashes of sea spray and snow. She knew his habits, how sometimes he drifted toward familiar places when the world inside his head went dim. The lighthouse. She broke into a run. Her boots slipped on wet gravel, her lungs burning as she fought the wind. Behind her, another light flared through the storm. A car door slammed. Then she heard him Cole's voice, sharp, urgent, "Grace." She turned, relief and fear colliding. He was striding toward her, a wool blanket slung over one arm, flashlight in the other. His coat was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. What happened? My father? He's out here somewhere. The lighthouse path. He knows it. Without hesitation. Cole nodded. "We'll split no," she said firmly. "Together?" He didn't argue. They fought their way down the hill, the beams of their flashlights crossing in the dark like two threads weaving through the storm. The old path to the lighthouse wound along the cliffside, narrow and treacherous even on calm days. Tonight, it was half swallowed by the tide. Rain stung Grace's eyes as they reached the lower ridge. She could barely see more than a few feet ahead. "Dad!" she screamed again, her voice ripped apart by the wind. Then, a shape in the beam of her light, her father, standing at the base of the lighthouse steps, coat flapping open, his hair wild with rain. He was murmuring something, words carried off by the gale. Grace stumbled forward. "Dad? It's me, Grace." He didn't seem to hear. His lips moved faster, repeating a line from a hymn he'd once sung every Sunday. "The light shall not be darkened, the light shall not be darkened. Dad, please." She grabbed his arm just as a gust nearly knocked them both sideways. Cole was there in an instant, anchoring them, his voice steady but loud over the wind. "We have to move now." A roar rose behind them. Grace turned just in time to see a massive wave surge against the rocks below, curling higher than the lighthouse steps. "Go!" Cole shouted, but the water came faster than her body could react. She felt the ground shift beneath her boots, the slippery stone giving way. Then Cole's arm wrapped around her, pulling her tight against him as the wave struck. It hit like a freight train, icy, brutal, full of salt and sand. She heard her father cry out, then felt herself shoved backward, pressed between Cole's body and the cold metal rail as water crashed over them. For a moment, there was no air, no sound, only pressure and cold. When the water receded, she coughed hard, blinking through the spray. Cole was still holding her with one arm, while bracing her father with the other, his back turned to the sea. His coat clung to his body, drenched, and his lips were blue. Inside, he gasped, now. Together they half-dragged, half-guided Ben up the steps. Grace's legs trembled, but she kept moving, every breath sharp with cold. The lighthouse door creaked under her weight as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust and seaweed, but it was dry. They lowered Ben onto the floor, wrapping the wool blanket around him. He was shivering, but conscious. Grace brushed the wet hair from his forehead. "You're safe, Dad. You're safe." Cole leaned against the wall, catching his breath, his shoulders shaking. His hands were scraped raw, knuckles bleeding where he'd hit the rail. Grace turned to him. "You could have been swept off." He shook his head, still breathing hard, not a chance. His voice cracked, hoarse but steady. "He's your father." She swallowed, throat tight. "You didn't have to come. I did." Outside, the wind howled again, the sea raging against the cliffs. Grace reached into her pocket, pulled out a small flashlight, and set it on the floor beside her father. Its beam pointed upward, catching the old brass of the lighthouse stairs. The silence between waves stretched longer now, the storm easing bit by bit. Cole sank down beside her, his hands still trembling from cold. For a long moment they sat there, side by side in the flickering light. Then Grace reached out without thinking, pressing her forehead lightly against his. His skin was freezing, his breath uneven, but when she closed her eyes, she could feel it, the faint, steady pulse beneath the chill. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer, only exhaled slowly, his breath warm against her cheek. Outside, the storm's fury began to fade, replaced by the low moan of retreating waves. They stayed there until the first weak light of dawn touched the horizon through the broken clouds. The old beacon above them flickered once, sputtered, and came to life, throwing its circle of light far out to sea, where dark water met pale sky. Grace watched it turn, slow and constant, casting its glow over the harbor. "Still burns," she murmured. Cole followed her gaze. "Always does," he said. The wind softened into a sigh. She looked at him, at the salt drying on his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. For the first time, she saw no armor there at all, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the storm outside had simply moved indoors to the quiet space between their breaths. The morning after the storm smelled of salt and cedar and wet earth. The air was heavy but clean, rinsed by the night's fury. Sunlight pushed through thinning clouds in soft, broken beams, gilding the battered shingles and the tangled shoreline below. Harbor Point stirred slowly awake. Down by the docks, men hauled branches from the water, boots splashing through puddles. Someone started a generator, its steady hum blending with gull cries overhead. A few houses still stood dark, but the town was alive again. At the inn, Grace opened the front door to the sight of her neighbor Noah perched on the roof, hammer in hand. Lost about 6 shingles. He called down. "Not bad, all things considered." Grace cupped her hands around her mouth. "You didn't have to come." He grinned. "Couldn't let your dad beat me to it." Her heart softened. In Harbor Point, help never came with ceremony. It arrived in the form of thermoses passed hand to hand. Extra propane tanks dropped off on porches, casseroles left at doors without names. Inside, the air was warm again, thick with the smell of coffee and iodine. Cole knelt beside her father in the sitting room, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The first aid kit lay open beside him, bandages folded with precise care. Ben sat quietly, arm extended, his eyes, still fogged by age and medication, followed Cole's movements. Grace stood by the doorway. watching. Cole spoke in a low, even voice. "I'm going to clean the cut again. Mr. Whitaker, it might sting, but only for a second." Ben nodded faintly. Cole dabbed the wound, his touch steady, unhurried. "You see this here," he said, pointing gently. "That's new tissue forming. It means it's healing." Grace blinked. He wasn't talking like a surgeon. He was talking like someone who understood how fragile trust could be. Evelyn appeared with a towel and placed it on her husband's lap. Cole thanked her with a quiet nod before taping the final strip of gauze. "Keep it dry for a day or two," he said. "No heroics." Ben smiled faintly. Doctor's orders. When it was done. Cole packed up the kit. Grace walked him to the kitchen, her chest still tight with something she didn't have a name for. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. "He's tougher than he looks." "Still," she insisted. "You didn't have to come back this morning. I wanted to check on you both." He hesitated. "And make sure the inn didn't float away." She laughed softly, the sound surprising even her. "We're not that lucky." The power was still out, so they set a skillet on the gas stove, the flame small but steady. Grace found a pack of cod fillets in the cooler, thawed and clean. Cole took over without asking old habits, she guessed. 8 minutes per side, he said, sprinkling salt with surgeon-like precision. No more, or it dries out. "Are you always this exact?" He glanced up, a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Occupational hazard. The smell of butter and lemon filled the kitchen. Outside, Noah hammered rhythmically on the roof. Inside, time slowed to the gentle sizzle of fish skin crisping in cast iron. Grace sliced bread, her hands moving automatically, while Cole flipped the fillets. "You cook like you operate," she said quietly. "Steady, serious. I don't get many opportunities to practice. You could start." He met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. They ate at the kitchen island, using mismatched plates, the kind her mother had collected over the years. Cole barely spoke, but something in his silence had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. It was thoughtful. After lunch, Grace took him a towel. "You're soaked through. You should change." He hesitated, then pushed up his sleeve to dry his arm, and she saw it. A pale scar ran along the inside of his forearm, thin but jagged, crossing the veins like a faint lightning bolt. "What happened?" she asked. He froze, as if he hadn't meant for her to see. "Residency," he said finally. "A shattered scalpel blade. I was trying to clamp an artery." She winced. That must have been brutal. It was humbling. He laughed softly. "I still have a little numbness here." He brushed his fingers over the mark, tracing it like an old memory. Without thinking, Grace reached out and touched the scar. Her fingertips barely grazed his skin, but it was enough to make him still completely. The warmth of him surprised her solid, alive. For months she'd known only the version of Cole built from restraint, the one who moved through life like he was afraid of breaking it. But here, under her touch, he was human. Flesh and pulse and quiet ache. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "Scars mean we survived something." He looked at her, eyes darker than she'd ever seen them, or that something survived us. The air shifted. The sound of the hammering outside faded. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Her hand lingered, his breath came shallow, his eyes searching hers. There was a question there, unspoken, hanging between them like the thin space between ocean waves before they meet. Then he stepped back. The movement was sudden, sharp. He set the towel down on the counter, voice tight. "I should get back to the hospital. They'll need me." "Cole," he shook his head, not unkindly, "you should rest. You've been through enough storms for 1 week." She watched him gather his coat, each movement precise, deliberate like a man rebuilding his walls brick by brick. When he reached the doorway, she said quietly, "You don't always have to run." He stopped, hand on the knob. For a moment, she thought he might turn around, but he didn't. "I know," he said, The door closed softly behind him. Grace stood in the kitchen, staring at the towel still damp on the counter. Outside, the sun slipped behind the clouds, casting the room in a dim silver light. She pressed her fingers to her lips, the ghost of warmth still there, as if the almost kiss had left a mark invisible to the eye, but impossible to forget. From the distance came the muffled sound of the sea steady, patient, the heartbeat of harbor, point itself. She breathed in, slow and steady, and let it fill her. The snow had come back to Harbor Point in thin, dry flakes that glittered against the windshields of black sedans lined outside North Shore Regional. The air smelled faintly of salt and exhaust, the city holding its breath as if it knew something was about to happen inside those glass walls. Grace had never seen a boardroom like that before, the kind that looked less like a place for healing and more like a private gallery. Every surface gleamed. Silver carafes steamed gently beside a tray of pastries no one touched. Around the long oak table sat donors in navy suits and pearl necklaces, the kind of people who said our community as if it were theirs to rent. Marla Keene moved among them with effortless grace, all lipstick and calculation. She clasped hands, tilted her head at just the right angle when she laughed, and never once looked like she was listening. At the far end of the room, Cole stood by a digital screen, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. His voice was even, measured, but Grace could hear the pulse beneath it, the drive that never seemed to rest. Our coastal clinic treated 382 uninsured patients last quarter, he said, clicking to a slide that showed a child running along the pier, hair lifted by wind, preventive care, physical therapy, speech programs. Lives changed because we decided access shouldn't depend on income. A murmur of polite approval rippled around the table. Someone in pearls dabbed at their eyes. Grace sat near the back, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't sure why Marla had invited her. For optics, Marla had said, smiling like it was a compliment. Grace had chosen a simple navy dress, hair pulled back. Her presence meant to say, steady wife, reliable image. Cole gestured to the chart behind him, the numbers rising like a quiet victory. With this expansion, we can reach the next 3 towns on the northern shore. It's not about prestige, he said. It's about doing what's right. Grace watched the way his jaw tightened on that last word. There was no pretense in him at moments like this. No arrogance, just conviction. And for the first time since she'd known him, she wanted something for him, not pity. Not redemption, just a fair chance to build what he believed in. When he finished, the applause was polite at first, then warmer. Even the older men in their tailored coats nodded with what looked like approval. Marla clapped loudest. That, she said, rising with her champagne voice, is precisely the leadership North Shore needs. She paused, scanning the room. And we are thrilled to announce the Foundation's unanimous enthusiasm for this project, with one small condition. Cole straightened slightly. Condition? Marla smiled, slow and deliberate. You know how investors are, Cole. Stability builds confidence, especially when it comes to public initiatives. The donors have requested reassurance that our leadership team embodies continuity. She turned, meeting Grace's eyes for the first time that morning, which is why the Foundation has included a provision in its 3-year review. The success of the expansion and continued funding will depend on the optics of stability within our executive ranks. Cole's eyes hardened. Optics, he repeated. You mean appearances? Marla's lashes fluttered. I mean the public perception of consistency, a life that reflects our values. A strong marriage, for example, conveys reliability, trust, dedication. A few board members shifted, pretending to check their notes. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy as lead. Marla turned to the others with a practiced smile. Dr. Harrington and his wife have been a shining example of partnership during a time of growth. We simply ask that this image of unity remain intact until the Foundation's formal audit in 3 years' time. After all, it would be terrible for the press to sense instability during such a crucial expansion. Cole didn't move. His voice, when it came, was almost too calm. "You're making my work conditional on my personal life." Marla tilted her head, that familiar look of feigned sympathy softening her expression. "Oh, Cole, no one's forcing you to stay married. We're merely aligning incentives." Someone chuckled softly at the table, mistaking cruelty for wit. Grace's throat tightened. She looked at Cole, waiting for him to speak, to fight, to refuse. But he only stood there, the muscles in his jaw working. His silence was louder than any outburst could have been. It hit her then, the full shape of it. The marriage, the proposal, the contract she'd signed with trembling hands. The way Marla had appeared that night at the hospital fundraiser, watching, measuring. None of it had been about love or even convenience. It had been about control. A man too brilliant to be handled needed a leash, and Grace had been chosen to hold it. Marla broke the silence with a bright laugh. "Let's toast to the next chapter of North Shore Regional," she said, lifting her glass. "To health, growth, and partnership." Glasses clinked. Grace sat motionless, her reflection warped in the polished surface of the table. The sound of champagne fizzing felt distant, hollow. Cole turned toward her then, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was fury in his, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that hardens, sharpens, the kind that plans. Marla leaned closer to a donor, whispering something that made him laugh. Her diamond earrings caught the light, each glinting like a blade. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped against the floor, papers rustled. Grace stood, unsure what to do with her hands. Marla approached her, smile poised. "Grace, dear, thank you for being here. You were perfect calm, gracious. The picture of strength under pressure." Grace met her gaze evenly. "You mean silent?" Marla's smile didn't waver. "Same thing, in the right room." She turned away before Grace could answer. Cole was already by the door, coat in hand. "Let's go," he said quietly. They walked out together into the brittle winter air. The snow had stopped, leaving a white sheen across the parking lot. For a long moment they just stood there, breath clouding in the cold. "Finally," Grace spoke. "She planned this from the beginning." He nodded once. "I know. So, what do we do now?" His eyes met hers, gray, steady, and colder than the snow around them. "Now," he said. "We stop letting them write the story." Grace looked back toward the building, the mirrored windows reflecting the sea. Somewhere behind them, Marla's laughter drifted faintly through the revolving doors. The wind picked up again, sharp and salt-edged, carrying the scent of the harbor. Grace pulled her coat tighter and fell into step beside him. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was charged with anger, yes, but also with something stronger. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just surviving this arrangement. She was part of the reckoning to come. The drive home from North Shore was a silence that hummed. Gray sky, low sun, snow drifting across the road in fine dust. The car heater ticked softly, its faint warmth unable to cut through the cold sitting between them. Grace kept her gaze on the blur of trees beyond the window. Cole's hand stayed tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. When they reached Ocean Bluff, the house stood as it always did, impeccable, unbothered, glass glinting like ice. But something about it felt hollow now, as if even the walls had overheard what Marla had said. Inside, Grace peeled off her coat and set it over the chair. Cole dropped his keys onto the counter, the metal clinking louder than it should have. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Grace broke the silence. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Did you marry me for your aunt's vote?" Cole froze mid-step. His shoulders tensed, then sank. "I married you to save the clinic," he said after a long pause. Marla assumed it was about optics. "I let her." She stared at him. "You let her." He turned toward her, eyes tired. "I didn't lie to you. I told you the terms." "You told me about a contract," she said sharply. "Not that you were part of one." Grace. She stepped closer, cutting him off. You stood in front of a church and let me promise myself into something you'd already sold to someone else. Her voice didn't rise. It trembled. Do you have any idea how small that makes me feel? His expression flickered, as if he'd expected anger, but not hurt. I didn't think no, she said, her words precise as glass. You didn't. You traded my dignity for your cause. He flinched, and for a moment she almost wished she hadn't said it. But it was true. Every moment since their wedding, every look, every carefully measured silence had been orchestrated for Marla's satisfaction, for his image, for the optics of stability. You think I did this lightly? He asked, voice rough now. You think it was easy to ask you. You didn't ask me, she interrupted. You needed something, and I was convenient. He moved toward her then, fast enough that she took a step back. His voice dropped. I never saw you that way. Then how do you see me? She demanded. Because I don't even know anymore. The kitchen light was pale, the kind that made everything sharper the edges of his jaw, the tremor in her hand as she held it against her chest. I see someone who saved my father, he said quietly. Someone who doesn't quit. Grace's laugh was short, brittle. That's not love. Cole, that's admiration from a safe distance. He looked down, fingers flexing once before falling still. Maybe distance is all I know how to give. That's not enough. The words hung between them, final and soft as snowfall. He reached for her not to hold, but to stop her. Maybe. She stepped back before he could touch her. Don't, she whispered. Please. Cole's hand dropped to his side. Grace. But she'd already turned away. Upstairs. The house felt different, unfamiliar, even cruel in its beauty. She pulled a duffel from the closet and began to pack. It didn't take long, a few sweaters, a pair of jeans. Her mother's quilt folded carefully on top. The quiet of it hurt most, the zipper sliding shut. The small sound of leaving. When she went back down, Cole was still standing in the kitchen. One hand braced on the counter, his head bowed. The stormlight from the window fell across him in cold stripes. She slipped off her wedding ring. The metal was warm from her skin. She set it on the counter beside the bowl of fruit, next to a single lemon, bright, bitter, clean. He didn't look up, but she knew he heard it when the ring touched marble, a small, metallic sound that echoed longer than it should have. Grace took a scrap of paper from the notepad by the fridge and wrote in her steady hand, "No humiliation." Remember? She left it beside the ring, waited by the lemon. When she opened the door, the cold air rushed in like a gasp. Grace, Cole said quietly behind her. She turned, her hand still on the knob. His eyes were unreadable, but his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. I didn't mean for it to hurt you. She managed a small, sad smile. You didn't have to mean it. You just had to let it. The wind carried her hair across her face. She pushed it back, stepped outside, and closed the door before she could lose her resolve. The drive to the inn felt endless and too short all at once. The sea was a smear of gray on the horizon, the kind of color that swallowed sound. When she pulled up to the familiar porch, her mother was waiting, a lantern in hand, the light swaying gently in the wind. Grace didn't say anything. She just walked into her mother's arms. Evelyn smelled like coffee and soap and everything safe. When she finally let go, she glanced back toward the ocean. The sky above it was pale, winter thin, the kind that promised another storm before spring could find them again. Somewhere out there, beyond the cliffs, was a house made of glass and silence. And on the counter, a ring beside a lemon. 10 days passed before anyone heard from Cole Harrington again. In Harbor Point, rumors traveled faster than the wind off the sea. One version said he'd resigned from North Shore after a fight with the board. Another claimed he'd fled the country, retreating to some private island off Maine. The papers ran stories with phrases like mystery withdrawal and internal dispute. Marla Keene's smiling face appeared on the evening news, offering clipped reassurances about continuity and leadership. Grace didn't watch the interviews. She couldn't. She spent those 10 days at the inn, helping her parents patch drywall, scrub floors, and reopen rooms that had been closed all winter. The work steadied her hands busy, heart quiet. Sometimes, while folding sheets, she'd find her gaze drifting toward the road, half expecting to see the black sedan. It never came. On the 11th morning, Ruth Delgado arrived. The nurse practitioner's pickup pulled into the gravel drive, tires crunching. She stepped out, her cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a manila envelope sealed and stamped. Grace met her on the porch. "Ruth, what's wrong?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "Nothing's wrong, but I think you should sit down." Inside, by the window, Grace slit the seal with trembling fingers. The packet was thick legal paper, notarized signatures, embossed seals that caught the light. She scanned the first page, transfer of ownership. Her name appeared at the top, printed cleanly, Grace Ellen Whitaker. Her eyes moved down the lines, Harbor Lantern Inn, parcel and property, debt fully discharged, property taxes prepaid through the year's end, 3 years ahead. What is this?" she whispered. Ruth slid another set of papers across the table. He didn't just fund the clinic. Grace, he freed it. He liquidated his equity in the MedTech group, everything tied to the North Shore contracts. Every share. He set up a perpetual endowment in his own name, but outside the hospital's control. The free coastal clinic will run as long as it has patients. Grace blinked, trying to make sense of it. He walked away from all of it. Ruth nodded, and gave the rest to you. Beneath the paperwork lay a single envelope, hand-addressed in that unmistakable slanted script. She turned it over, her name again. Inside was one sheet of stationery. "Grace, you were never a prop. I'm sorry I acted like one. I should have said it sooner, but my life has always been louder than my words. You said I traded your dignity for my cause. You were right. I spent years fighting to give others a voice while silencing my own guilt. This house, this clinic, they were never meant to own you. They're yours now. The inn, the debt, the weight, all of it gone. Use your voice. It's stronger than mine. See?" Grace set the letter down, her breath trembling. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the kettle cooling on the stove. Ruth sat quietly across from her, eyes soft. He came to the clinic before he left. Didn't say much, just signed everything. Told me to make sure this reached you. Said you'd know what to do with it. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. The words blurred on the page. Outside, the winter light spilled across the water in silver ribbons. The inn sign swayed gently on its hinges. Newly painted, her phone buzzed. The caller ID froze her where she sat. Marla Keene. For a moment, Grace almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Grace!" Marla's voice snapped through the line, sharp as broken glass. "Do you have any idea what he's done?" Grace said nothing. "He dismantled my entire funding structure, liquidated half his holdings, and redirected the assets into an independent trust. Do you realize what that means? The board has no oversight, no leverage, nothing." Grace swallowed, her voice calm. "Maybe that's the point." "Don't be naive," Marla hissed. "He's ruined years of work. And for what? For you. For your family's little inn." Grace's throat tightened. "He didn't do it for me," she said softly. "He did it because you left him nothing else to believe in." For a second, Marla didn't respond. Then came a bitter laugh. "You have no idea who he really is. Do you? He's not just a surgeon, Grace. He's a billionaire who could have bought 10 hospitals and burned them to the ground if he wanted. And now he's walked away from all of it." Grace closed her eyes, the words sinking in. She remembered the way he dressed, impeccable but never showy. The quiet efficiency. The private car that never lingered long. She'd assumed it was discipline, not distance. Now she understood wealth had never been his armor. Guilt had. "Marla," she said finally, her tone even, "you should let him go." The line went dead. Grace sat there for a long time, the letter still open on the table, the ink soft from where her tears had fallen. A billionaire. The thought felt absurd, unreal, yet it explained everything: the house on the bluff, the way he never flinched at cost, the silent power he never used to harm, only to shield. He hadn't disappeared to escape scandal. He'd disappeared to make sure no one could touch what mattered most to him again. Her hand drifted to the ring mark, still faint on her finger. Not an absence anymore, but a reminder. Outside, gulls wheeled above the pier. The water had gone calm, reflecting the pale sky like glass. Grace rose and walked to the window. The inn's old sign creaked softly in the wind, its lettering bright and clean. The harbor lantern, the light that never went out. She touched the glass, whispering to no one, "You kept your promise." The reflection staring back at her wasn't a woman abandoned, or a wife without a husband. It was someone who'd been trusted with something larger than forgiveness. She looked down again at the letter, its final line underlined once. The ink slightly smudged. "Use your voice. It's stronger than mine." When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Then I will." The sea answered softly against the shore, as if to say it already knew. The town hall smelled faintly of salt and varnish and old pine. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor as neighbors packed themselves shoulder to shoulder, coats dusted with sea snow. Harbor Point hadn't seen this kind of crowd in years, not for a fundraiser, not for an election, not even for the 4th of July parade. On the stage, the banner read, "North Shore Coastal Clinic, Future and Funding Forum." Below it sat a panel of volunteers, nurses, and the new interim director. Ruth Delgado stood at the podium, hair pinned back, voice calm as she welcomed everyone. Grace sat in the third row, her palms damp against her skirt. Around her were faces she'd known her whole life: fishermen, shop owners, retirees, and children squirming in laps. These were the people the clinic had kept alive, the people Cole had fought for, the people who would lose it all if Marla and her donors had won. Ruth's voice carried gently across the room. "Dr. Harrington's endowment ensures the clinic will remain independent and self-sustaining. But the public record matters. This is where we speak our gratitude or our doubts. This is where we write what comes next." She nodded toward the microphone set up in the aisle. "Anyone who wants to share, please do." A long pause, then the slow shuffle of boots. The first to step forward was Charlie Madsen, a lobster man with weathered hands and a patched jacket. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Doc fixed my shoulder last year. Never took a dime. I couldn't have kept working without him." Next came a teacher, Miss Havers, from the elementary school. She held a folder of drawings from her students. "He treated kids who didn't even have insurance cards," she said. "He used to tell them, 'You bring me your report card instead. That's payment enough.'" A grandmother rose next, her cane tapping softly. She opened a pill organizer, shaking it slightly. "He found me a way to get these for free," she said, voice trembling. "Didn't even ask my name the first time. Just said, 'You matter, ma'am. Let's start there.'" Applause rippled gently through the room, not loud, but full. Grace's throat tightened. One by one, people stood, their stories weaving together like threads in a net, ordinary lives pulled back from the edge by one man's stubborn mercy. When the murmur settled, Ruth's eyes met Grace's from the stage. A silent question. Grace hesitated, heart beating hard enough to hear. Then she stood. The crowd turned slightly as she stepped into the aisle, her boots clicking softly against the wood. When she reached the microphone, the room fell still. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "My name is Grace Whitaker," she began. "Some of you know me from the inn. Some of you might know me from another story, the one the papers told." A soft rustle moved through the crowd. She continued anyway. "I won't stand here and pretend everything that happened was fair," she said. "Dr. Harrington and we began something that wasn't honest, at least not at first. I thought I was helping my parents. He thought he was helping his cause. Somewhere in the middle, we both forgot what helping really means." She took a breath, her hands trembling only slightly. But I also can't stand here and let you believe that what he did for this town was anything less than real. You've heard the stories. You've seen the work. He fought for this place with every ounce of himself, and when the system tried to own him, he walked away instead of selling his soul. Someone in the back murmured assent. Grace's gaze swept the room, her eyes bright but clear. "He did wrong by me," she said quietly, "but he did right by you, by my father, by every kid who walks into that clinic without a dollar or a name anyone remembers." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reverent. She looked down once, gathering herself, then back up again. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she said. "It means refusing to stay small. It means letting the truth breathe on its own, without shame." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the lobsterman stood again and started clapping. It was slow, hesitant at first, then stronger, spreading like a tide through the room. Grace's eyes stung. She gave a small nod, stepped back from the microphone, and turned toward her seat and stopped. At the back of the hall, just beyond the doorway, stood Cole. He was half-shadowed by the frame, hair damp from snow, a faint bruise under one eye where, she guessed, a reporter's camera or a thrown word had hit too close. He looked thinner somehow, quieter, like the storm had finally carved him down to the man underneath. He didn't move while she spoke. He hadn't tried to interrupt, hadn't tried to rewrite what she said. He just stood there, listening, hands folded, face unreadable. When the applause faded and the crowd began to stir again, she glanced back once more. He met her eyes across the distance, no plea, no defense, just a kind of acceptance that felt heavier than regret. He turned then, slow and deliberate, and stepped back into the snow. Grace watched him go until the door swung shut behind him. The cold crept in for just a moment, brushing her face like a ghost of the sea wind. She exhaled, steady and deep. Outside, through the frosted window, she could see his figure heading down the hill toward the harbor road, disappearing into the white blur of late winter. She thought of the letter again. Use your voice. She had. And though he was gone, she could almost hear him exhale, relieved. The first scent of spring came not from flowers, but from cedar sharp and sweet after a morning rain. At the Harbor Lantern Inn, everything felt freshly scrubbed. The shutters gleamed white again, laundry snapped in the wind, the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen window. Evelyn sat on the porch in her sweater, shelling peas into a metal bowl. The sound was rhythmic, comforting, the kind of sound that said, "We're still here." Ben hummed nearby, kneeling in the damp garden soil, pressing seeds into neat rows. His voice was stronger now, the words forming between small bursts of concentration. When he looked up, Grace waved from the walkway, and he grinned, proud, his cheeks smudged with earth. She smiled back, her heart loosening. It had been 7 weeks since the town hall, 7 weeks since Cole had vanished into the noise of the press and come out quieter, unseen. The news had died down. Marla Keene had retreated to Boston, her empire intact, but her reach clipped. The clinic doors stayed open. Patients kept coming. The town breathed easier. Grace still walked to the jetty most evenings. It wasn't about waiting anymore. It was about remembering how to breathe. That evening, as the light faded to the blue between day and night, she found herself following the familiar path past the dunes, her boots whispering against the sand. The sea was calm, a mirror catching the first shy stars. At the end of the jetty, near the light beacon, someone sat on the weathered bench. Cole. He looked up when she stopped a few steps away. For once, his hands were empty. No file, no phone, no pretense of purpose. Just him, in a dark coat, and an expression that carried both humility and exhaustion. Grace. Her name in his voice sounded different, quieter, less armored. She didn't move closer right away. "You found your way back? I wasn't sure I should." He looked down at the rough stone beneath his hands. "I figured I owed you an apology, but I didn't know if saying it would help or just reopen everything." Grace stepped forward until she could see his profile in the soft wash of the beacon's light. "Sometimes an apology isn't for reopening," she said. "It's for closing properly." He nodded once, eyes still lowered. "Then I'll say it right. I'm sorry, not just for the lie we started with, but for what it made you carry. I told myself I was protecting you, but really, I was protecting my own pride. I thought I could control everything if I just kept feeling nothing." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of the tide against the rocks. Grace listened in silence. "I don't expect you to forget it," he went on, "or to start over. I just needed you to know, I see it now. All the places I went wrong. Every one of them has your name on it, and I hate that." Grace looked out toward the horizon where the sea met the sky, blurred and endless. "I don't want to forget it," she said. "It's part of what got us here." He glanced at her, a question flickering behind his eyes. "Forgiveness doesn't erase a wound," she said softly. "It just lets it stop bleeding." For a long moment, neither spoke. The light swept across the water in slow, patient turns. Then she extended her hand, palm open between them. Cole hesitated, as if unsure he deserved to take it. But when he did, his fingers curled around hers with a quiet certainty. No tremor, no need to grip too tight. No contracts, she said. No optics, he replied. Just choice. She finished. "If we do this, we choose each other every ordinary morning, every rough tide. That's the only promise I want." His breath left him in a shaky laugh, almost disbelieving. "That sounds harder than marriage." "It is," she said, smiling faintly. "That's why it's real." He turned her hand over, tracing the faint ring mark still visible on her skin. "No ring yet," he murmured. "Maybe someday," she said. "If it feels like beginning, not atonement." He nodded, the understanding deep and simple. They sat for a while without speaking, watching gulls drift over the surf, the air turning cool and salt-sweet. Somewhere down the coast, the lighthouse lamp turned again, its steady beam sweeping across the jetty, catching their shadows where they touched. Grace stood first. "Come on," she said. "Mom's probably finished the peas." He smiled small, real, the kind that reached his eyes. When he rose, he moved carefully, like a man relearning his balance. Together, they walked back along the jetty. The sky deepened into indigo. The inn's windows glowed gold against the dark. The old sign creaked in the breeze, the words "Harbor Lantern" glinting under the fresh paint. Halfway down the path, Grace looked over her shoulder at the sea. The tide was rolling in, slow and rhythmic, washing clean the footprints they'd left behind. She took a breath that felt like the first full one in months. Cole's voice came quiet beside her. "You ever think the sea forgives us before we forgive ourselves?" She glanced at him, the corners of her mouth softening. "Maybe that's why we keep coming back." As they reached the porch steps, Ben's laughter floated through the open kitchen window, mingling with the clink of Evelyn's bowl. Light spilled out, warm and alive. Grace paused on the threshold. Cole's hand brushed hers, just once not claiming, just steadying. She didn't pull away. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. Outside, the lighthouse beam turned one last time, sweeping across the water like a benediction. Two shadows crossed the porch and stepped through the door together. The sea kept its rhythm. The lantern stayed lit. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in the quiet spaces after the storm, in the moments when pride finally loosens its grip, and love chooses to stay even when it has every reason to walk away. Grace and Cole's story reminds us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or pretending the pain never happened. It's about allowing ourselves to see the good that can grow from the broken places, to understand that dignity and tenderness can live in the same breath, and that real love, the kind that lasts, is often born not in perfection, but in repentance and patience. We all carry locked rooms in our hearts, filled with what we've lost and what we fear to face. But sometimes, when we finally open those doors, light gets in, soft, steady, and enough to guide us home. And maybe that's the quiet miracle that, even after everything, we still find the courage to try again. Thank you for being here with us, for listening, feeling, and walking through this story with an open heart. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us keep this little light burning to tell more stories that remind us what it means to be human, to forgive, and to start again. Art. Your presence here means more than you know. Until the next story, take care of your heart and keep a bit of kindness for the world.